Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Flawed Theology Podcast. I'm Phil.
And I'm Susie, and we're asking the question, if your theology were wrong, wouldn't you want to know?
Welcome to another episode, and we want to remind you guys about the Facebook group called Dangerous Questions. It's been a really cool place to connect with you guys, and it's been a really good source of topics for episodes. So if you ever have things that you'd love to hear us talk about, that group is the place to post them, and we'd love to see you on there. Just look for Dangerous Questions, and you'll find us. It says Dangerous Questions, a Flawed Theology Podcast community. That's how you know you got the right one. And then also a reminder of where you can listen to us. We're on all the major podcast platforms. And also there's been a recent change because Google Podcasts went away magically. I don't know why. I just got some notification like a couple of months ago. They're like, hey, Google Podcast is going away. And now your podcast can be exported over on YouTube Music. So that's where we are now on the Google universe on YouTube Music. And we're also on regular YouTube, but it's just the audio. And also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Podbean and all the other platforms that are out there. So feel free to find us on any one of those things or on our website, and rate us and review us if you can. We love the feedback. And yeah. We wanted to point out someone who's in the atheist community, Tim Mills. He is the owner of the YouTube channel Harmonic Atheist, which probably many of you guys have heard of. Maybe you watch his videos. He has very in-depth interviews with a lot of people across the deconversion space. He just had Dan Barker on, which was really cool. But he is in the midst of a really difficult situation family-wise. He's in the midst of a kind of a nasty divorce and a child custody situation. And one of the things that is kind of critical to his success in this issue is getting financial support, because he made the decision several years ago to go full time with his Harmonic Atheist channel on YouTube and all his other social media stuff that he does. And so one of the things that's being attacked in the suit is, that, now he's an atheist content creator, and so he's not fit to have his kids and things like that. So we want to make sure that people out there know about the situation. We're not going to go into a lot of detail because it's obviously very personal, but it's a very scary situation for his kids. It's really scary for him. And so we are going to be posting several links in the show notes for ways that you can support him financially. And obviously, one of the biggest things you can do is go to his channel and view his content, because that helps him financially. So we just want to put that out there as a way for people to connect with him. If you've at all been impacted by Tim and Harmonic Atheist, please go out there and support him in any way that you feel that you can. Our topic today it's a big one. We've been mulling over getting into this, and we're going to talk about prophecy. And we're going to kind of talk about this from a couple different angles. We're going to talk about what prophecy is in the sense of future casting and forthtelling, and then talk about what really qualifies as prophecy. We'll talk about some failed prophecies. And then kind of at the end of this, we'll talk about how there's been kind of a shift in modern Christianity of what prophecy is now. So why don't we start off with a little bit of definition stuff. What is prophecy? Let's go to you and your favorite source, Got Questions.
From Got Questions.
Yeah.
So prophecy is the noun and prophesy is the verb form. Prophecy at its most basic definition is a message from God. So basically, to prophesy is to proclaim a message from God. And the person who does that is a prophet. And it doesn't always have to reveal the future or predict the future. It's not a necessary element. But if there is an element of foretelling to the prophecy, then presumably only if it comes true. Since only God can know the future, then any message about the future that comes true must be from God, because God can only tell the future.
Right. Yeah. The only way that anyone would know the future is because of God. You'll see that when Christians talk about astrologers and all the other, tarot readers, well, that's all demonic, because they're telling the future and they're not getting it from God. But when we do it, it's from God.
Right. And a verse to support this is from 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 21. For prophecy never had its origin in the human will, but prophets, though human, spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. So basically, humans are just vessels for God to talk through.
Conduits, yeah.
Conduits.
Yeah.
Good word.
Yeah. So then, of course, that leads to the thing of there's the prophets of God. And then, of course, that there's false prophets. In Deuteronomy talks about there's two ways that you would know that a prophet is either real or fake. The first one would be if a prophet directs you to follow other gods. Well, obviously he's fake because the real God wouldn't say, hey, go worship or follow another God. So that's a good quick litmus test there.
Yeah.
The second thing is like if the thing he says will happen doesn't happen, well, then he's got to be a fake too.
And keep this in mind as we go through this episode.
Right.
This is a clear statement. If the thing does not come true, this is a false prophet.
And you'll see this pointed out in the Bibles. This person is a false prophet, and this person is a false prophet.
Yeah.
But you don't really ever see, when Ezekiel prophesies something and then it doesn't happen to come to pass. You don't see that anyone ever say, "Oh, well, Ezekiel was a false prophet." So
right, exactly, yeah. So Deuteronomy 13 is where it talks about the real and the fake prophets. Chapter 13, verse 1-3 describes that God will also test you to see if you can detect a false prophet. So do you know what this makes me think of? Like, I don't know if your work does this, probably, that they'll send you a fake phishing email and then you have to like report it as spam or, God forbid, if you click the link, you're like,
if you click the link,
you have to go through like 1 year of training. Yeah. Yeah. It's just like that.
Yeah. People want to say God is love and he only does things to help his people. But no, he's also going to attempt to trick you. And he wants you to figure out if it's a false prophet or not, Yeah, that is a good analogy. The fake phishing emails.
Yeah. Verse 3 says, "You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul." But see, I don't know what loving God has to do with being tricked by a prophet. Those are two separate things. Yeah. You can love God and also be kind of gullible and be tricked by somebody.
Yeah, you could totally be like hoodwinked by a smooth talker or because you really want to believe something. I'm not sure that really affects how much you love somebody, but
So that leads to the next question. What exactly happens when a prophet is deemed to be false? And for that, we need to go to Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 5. "That prophet or dreamer must be put to death for inciting rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. That prophet or dreamer tried to turn you from the way the Lord your God commanded you to follow. You must purge the evil from among you." So this means that today, if there are false prophets following the instructions in Deuteronomy, we should put them to death. Yeah. Do we know any false prophets today?
I made a list of some people. Some of these are right off the top of my head, and then some of them I kind of Googled just to see people who are claiming to be prophets today. So in my fundamentalist Christian days, the biggest person who is into like prophesying, especially the rapture and all that stuff, was Harold Camping. He's this guy that owned a radio station called Family Radio, and they were syndicated all over, the United States. And he predicted the rapture was going to happen. I think the first one he predicted was like 1983 or something like that. Of course, that came and went. And he literally was coming out with a prophecy almost every year saying, "Oh, I read the numbers wrong. It's going to be the 1984. It's going to be 1986. According to the Bible, he's a false prophet. And then right along that same vein was Hal Lindsey, who wrote the book Late Great Planet Earth. He was another rapture predictor. Clearly, no raptures happened, so false prophet.
Joel Osteen, does he consider himself a prophet?
I kind of lumped like all the prosperity gospel preachers into the prophet thing because I feel like they're selling a message of like, if you believe and you send me your $500 and your handkerchief, then I'm going to bless that thing and good things are going to happen to you. That's like, prosperity gospel seems like a happy-go-lucky, feel-good prophecy type thing. So Joel Osteen, Creflo Dollar is another one of these people. Jeremiah Johnson, who is the guy who predicted that Trump was going to win the election in 2020.
Yeah, that's funny.
And then he had to come out and say that he was wrong. But before he did that, several times he was like, well, it's not over yet. Like all the way up to like inauguration day, he was like, it's not over yet, and then even until January 6th, it's not over yet. So
you gotta wonder what that does to him inside.
Well, and I don't even know how you have any kind of credibility.
Yeah. And how do you even have confidence in yourself? Like, did he actually think that he could prophesy before?
Yeah.
Or was it like all an act the whole time?
Yeah, he has a whole website, which I put the link in our notes here. And I was like looking through it earlier today. And it's just like, it all sounds so well and good, But this guy like legit claims to be a prophet. Another one is Cindy Jacobs. She prophesied during COVID that it was going to be gone by Passover, which of course didn't come to fruition. I hadn't heard of this lady, but her name's Jennifer Ivaz. She calls herself the praying prophet. She sometimes offers public prophecies about national or international events. She prophesied that a drought in California was going to end like in some year, and then of course it didn't end until like 2 years later. Greg Locke, another false prophet. Kenneth Copeland, the guy who
Ooh, that
he,
guy. He
he,
looks like the devil incarnate. He's what
he
I
really
imagine the
does.
devil looks like. It's
He really
oh, he
does.
looks evil.
And he's just like a money fleecer, and he thinks that like if you have enough faith, then God's gonna bless you. Like
So apparently, according to the Bible, we should be putting to death all of these people, putting them to
right,
death. And even though I don't like them, I don't necessarily want to kill them. I don't think they quite deserve that.
right,
But I did want to read from Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 6 through 9. This is really horrible. It says, if your very own brother or your son or daughter or the wife you love or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods, gods that neither you nor your ancestors have known, gods of the peoples around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other, do not yield to them or listen to them. Show them no pity. Do not spare them or shield them. You must certainly put them to death. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death, and then the hands of all the people.
yowzers. It's
What
like
the hell?
this is one of those things where you're like, yeah, but the God of the Bible is one of love. Really?
Right. Now let's think about this for a second. It's possible for somebody to get tricked by one of these false prophets.
Right.
Is putting them to death really the best thing? Or let's just assume for a minute that Yahweh is real. Okay. And wouldn't it be better for Yahweh to gently reveal himself to that person,
Right.
bring that person back to the fold in a
Yeah.
nice, loving, caring way, not strike them dead or have people stone them? Like, what?
That seems to be always the easy solution in the Bible.
This is absolutely like about control. It's not about love. It's control.
Yeah. So some other things about prophecy. According to Got Questions, they say that prophecy ended with the apostles and that the apostles fulfilled a prophetic role by documenting Jesus in the New Testament. There's a lot of Christians that believe that the concept of prophecy, ended with basically the death of the last apostle, which according to legend would have been John. So once John was dead, there was no more prophecy in the sense of like foretelling the future. And First Corinthians, you put this in your notes and I mentioned it as well later, but First Corinthians talks about prophecy as a spiritual gift, along the same lines as speaking in tongues. But Paul says that prophesying is better because it builds up the church instead of the individual. And, he says to seek the better gift, don't seek to speak in tongues, seek to prophesy because it edifies and builds up the church. So prophecy was a big deal as far as the spiritual gifts go. In my upbringing, we used to do spiritual gift inventories. Did you ever do those?
No.
Like a test. It's almost like a psychometric test to tell you what your spiritual gift was. But prophecy was always, one that people wanted to get because of this verse where Paul's like, fervently desire the best gifts. Why is prophecy such an important part of Christianity? Like, why do you think it is?
I think many Christians use fulfilled prophecy to legitimize the Bible as like the actual word of God and quote unquote the truth.
Right.
And Got Questions, this article says, from Genesis to Malachi, there are over 300 specific prophecies detailing the coming of this anointed one. I mean, they don't say specific fulfilled prophecies.
Right.
If you listen to the Atheist Experience, a lot of the callers that call in, the evidence that they present for Christianity is the fulfilled prophecies. Like the most quoted one is Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just talking to like a lot of my family members, they're just all really impressed by these fulfilled prophecies that they believe prove their God.
Yeah. And the thing that really you find out like kind of post Christian is that you realize that like as a believer, you have no historical context for any of those things that are taken as prophecy. And we'll get into some of this later, but most of the things that you view as prophecy in the Bible, and then you then see some fulfillment, they're actually not correlated together at all. They're like, it's basically someone looking at a past event and then making a story kind of fit the narrative, But do you think that prophecy is like the best way to like legitimize Christianity?
No. And it's not the best way for God to talk to us either.
Right.
The book Seeing Through Christianity by Bill Zurcher talks about this. He says an all-powerful deity could find a better means to communicate. Divine prophecy entails selecting one individual and communicating with others through him. Such a communication system is slow, open to misinterpretation, and susceptible to skepticism. An omnipotent deity could simultaneously communicate with perfect clarity to all humans whenever he chose.
Right.
I think that says it the best. I mean,
Yeah, it really does. Because, like, if you're an all knowing, all powerful God, like, you could easily prove your existence. You wouldn't have to use prophecy. You wouldn't
yeah.
have to rely on the wonders of nature. You wouldn't rely on a human compiled book. You would just come down and you would be like, hey, I'm real. And now it's up to you to do what you want.
But if the God of the religion were not real, then this is what would have to happen. You would have to have a few people be like, oh, I'm channeling this God, and now you all have to listen to me.
Right.
If they're a con artist or if they're just delusional, doesn't matter.
Right.
That's the way you have to do it if there is no actual God who's communicating.
Yeah, because everything becomes open to interpretation then. And that's also why you have so many different versions of what's right.
Interpretations.
Because, like, well, if something doesn't really exist, it's open to interpretation. You can basically say, well, this is true based on, my biases and my life experiences, and here's how I know it's true. But if something's like verifiably true, you don't need all that. You don't need the anecdotal evidence and all that stuff. You actually have data and evidence to support what is actually true. In order for something to be considered a fulfilled prophecy, there's kind of some criteria, and we stole this from Lars. So
yeah, the kind of prophecy we're talking about here is the kind that tells the future, not one that's just channeling God's voice.
Right, yes. A foretelling of events to come.
This is from Lars. He did a really good job putting this together. These are 7 criteria. The first 6 are like, this is what has to happen for it to be a prophecy, like to even be considered a prophecy that's eligible for fulfillment. Number 7 is like, and it was fulfilled.
Right.
So number 1 is it was verifiably made as a prophecy prior to the events claimed to fulfill it. So I think that's pretty obvious. You can't, after the fact, write a prophecy and pretend like you had written it before.
Well, and I think the key word in that thing is verifiably made prior. Because there's a lot of things in the Bible that look like they're made prior, or they're sold as these things were made prior, but they really weren't. The second one is fulfillable by a specific set of circumstances with minimal ambiguity. So again, not open to interpretation. It's like, it's very precise. The circumstances are very obvious.
Number 3 is fulfillable in a specific time window. The narrower, the better. So you can't just take 10,000 years to fulfill it, because anything can happen in 10,000 years and everything's liable to happen. Yeah,
that's kind of what the lady who predicted the droughts ending in California, I think it was in 2015 or something like that. She predicted that this drought was going to end. And the drought didn't end. It did eventually end, but it wasn't until like 2017. So she didn't put like a time limit on it. She just said, oh, the drought's going to end. Well, of course, because no drought's going to last forever. Like, I mean, it's not possible. It has to rain sometime. Like,
yeah. The
next one, number 4, is not fulfillable by people aware of it and trying to fulfill it.
Right.
It'd have to be like it's like a blind test. Nobody could know about what the fulfillment should be.
Right. I can't make a prophecy that says, I predict that Phil is going to buy a pink couch next year. If you know about this prophecy, you could go out and buy a pink couch so that you fulfill my prophecy.
Right, exactly.
Now, if you go buy a pink couch and you don't even know about my prophecy, then, hey, that might be fulfilled.
Right.
Number 5, not claim to be fulfilled only in the same work or collection in which it was claimed as prophecy. So that, like, it's everything in the Bible.
Yeah. So basically no circular sourcing. Like, it has to be outside verification, that it happened. So, and then number 6 is not predictable by normal means available to the one prophesying.
So that would be like, I predict that the icebergs will melt by the year 2100.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that's reasonably could happen based on the data we have with climate change. So that wouldn't be a valid prophecy.
Yeah. And then the last criteria is like, you have to verifiably fulfill all of the criteria above, according to all the criteria above. So you got to meet all that criteria and then come true.
And it comes true. Yeah.
Yeah. It's got to come true.
Yeah,
otherwise,
that's the most important one.
Yeah. It's kind of the main thing.
Thank you, Lars.
Yeah. Thanks, Lars. The biggest prophetic thing in the Bible and in the Old Testament for sure is definitely the Messiah. All of Jewish history from the dawn of the civilization was looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, the anointed one. And there's all these different prophecies throughout the Old Testament that are said to point to Jesus coming and him being the Messiah.
So why did Israel want a Messiah? Why did they need one?
Well, for the perpetuation and the duration of like Jewish history, they were under attack by somebody. Assyria,
Yeah.
Babylon. And then, Yahweh was this all powerful God who was supposed to deliver them and protect them, but they were always getting oppressed and occupied and relocated to somewhere. And so the Israelites themselves were losing faith in God. And so you had to have something to kind of cure the cognitive dissonance, where you were saying, well, God's all powerful and he's going to rescue us. But these damn Babylonians or these damn Assyrians, they keep conquering us. What the hell? So they came up with this kind of idea of like, oh, well, we must have some kind of sin that we need to atone for. All the bad shit that has happened to the Jewish people is because they're atoning for some sin that they have to pay for, but there's never any, it seems like there's never any end to the sin. Even now, which is supposed to be post Messiah, there's still sin that we're atoning for, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And so the idea of a Messiah was that the Messiah would come to free them from that persecution.
Right. So the Old Testament doesn't say too much directly about the Messiah and what the Messiah will be like, but the first 4 verses of Isaiah chapter 11 describe the Messiah. They say, it will be a descendant of David. He will have wisdom, understanding, and faithfulness, and he will strike the earth, meaning war. Ezekiel 37 verses 24 to 28 basically says that the house of David will rule forever.
Forever. That's a long time.
Yeah. And the Old Testament never anywhere ever prophesied that the Messiah would be God's son. He was expected to be human.
Right.
It was never said that he would be born of a virgin, or be crucified, or resurrected, or sacrificed at all. That was never, ever mentioned.
That's one of those things I don't think I ever realized, like when I was learning about that kind of stuff in the Old Testament, like Psalm 22, they try to use Psalm 22 as like a description of the crucifixion. It never really says that was the Messiah. Like they just take that story and they say, oh, that seems to fit. So how did the gospel writers try to fit Jesus into the messianic prophecies? Well, the first step was they had to get Jesus be a descendant of King David.
Yeah, that's number one.
Yeah, the genealogies in Matthew and Luke are really important, but there's some problems with those genealogies, aren't there?
Yeah, there's a few. First of all, they're different.
Right.
I guess they say Luke is Mary's genealogy, but she's from the line of Levi.
Yes.
That's out because that wouldn't even be like a Davidic line.
Right.
It's funny. In Matthew, there's a guy in the genealogy, Jeconiah, King Jeconiah.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same guy who in Jeremiah 22, he was prophesied to be childless and that none of his descendants will ever sit on the throne of David or rule again. Yet here he is in the genealogy in Matthew who has a son leading directly line of David.
Right.
And there's like some really like finagling. I was on some Christian websites earlier. Like they really finagle this and try to reconcile.
Oh, they really finagle it. Yeah, because the genealogies are so different. There's people missing. It doesn't account for like the number of years. You could really dig into this. We're not going to get too into the weeds.
Yeah, you could do a whole episode just on the genealogies.
The first thing that they had to do was they got to get Jesus in the line of David because that's what the messianic prophecies said.
Yeah.
So they took little bits of the Old Testaments and then they had the Gospels, which we should point out that these Gospels were not written by the namesakes of the disciples that they're named after. So the Gospels were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the disciples. They were written much later by people kind of assuming those names.
Yeah, and the Gospels were really good at taking little bits of the Old Testament and writing the Gospels in such a way to fulfill those little bits. An example of this is in Hosea chapter 11, it says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Skipping forward to Matthew, whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew saw this little bit in the Old Testament, decided, oh, that must be a prophecy referring to Jesus going to Egypt and then being called out of Egypt. So I need a way to get Jesus to Egypt. So he came up with the King Herod story where now Jesus, Mary, and Joseph have to flee to Egypt. Now Jesus can be called out of Egypt. And this is the only gospel that has this story in it. And in the gospel, it even says, "This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt, I called my son." So the author is admitting, yes, this was written or allegedly happened this way to fulfill this little bit of the Old Testament that we interpret as Jesus.
Right.
But if you read it, it's actually not referring to Jesus.
Right. And the whole theme of Hosea is like this like Old Testament parable about the unfaithfulness of Israel. And the real comparison is that Israel was this like whoring wife and Hosea still loved the wife even though she was a prostitute. So that doesn't make any sense. Like, how do you conflate that to the Messiah?
It's reaching.
They cherry picked it. So
yeah.
What's another good example? This is one of your favorite ones. Like,
yeah, this is my favorite. So Matthew, of course, loved to reference the Old Testament scriptures. He saw the part in Zechariah that says that Jesus would ride into Jerusalem, quote, humble and mounted on a donkey, comma, on a colt, comma, the foal of a donkey. And we went into this on another episode, so we won't go as deep, but he completely misunderstood that this was referring to just one colt, not a donkey and a colt. So he wrote in Matthew that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey and on a colt. And this is the only gospel that has him riding on two animals, not one.
Right.
So Matthew was he was big into like digging through the Old Testament and trying to fill little things that he found there.
The target audience for Matthew was the Jewish people. So that's why there's all these references to the Old Testament stuff, because that was the target audience. And then, Luke was written more towards the Greeks. And he's trying to hit his target audience by referencing all the stuff that they would know from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And another example is the bodies rising from the grave and wandering around Jerusalem after the crucifixion, because that's referenced somewhere.
Also in Matthew.
Yeah, that's in Matthew, but it references something in, I want to say it's Isaiah.
I think it is in Isaiah. Yeah, there's a few different verses that it could be fulfilling.
Yeah.
But yeah, for a lot of reasons, that never happened.
Yeah.
Because there should be other corroborating witnesses and documentation if there had been a zombie uprising in Jerusalem.
Right.
Secondly, if there had been a zombie uprising in Jerusalem, don't you think that would have overshadowed Jesus's resurrection? Like, who cares if one guy comes back to life if 3 days before there was like a whole town of zombies?
All right, so let's talk about, the big thing that Christians like to use is that the Bible is full of prophecies that are said to be fulfilled. So we're going to dig into were these prophecies really fulfilled? And we'll talk about Isaiah 53 first, which is, the one about the Messiah, the suffering servant. It's a very popular one.
And it's long, so we won't read it. But Christians have long claimed this as a description of Jesus and the crucifixion. But the big question is, who actually is the suffering servant? Is it Jesus, or is it Israel as a whole, or is it a subset of Israel? And Seen Through Christianity, the book, has a chapter on prophecy, and then Appendix 3 goes into great detail just on this prophecy. So keeping in mind the historical context that Phil already said of why Israel was being abandoned by Yahweh, this makes sense that there's these so-called prophecy cycles where Israel would suffer, and then a prophet would come along and he would prophesy that deliverance was right around the corner. Don't lose hope. Or they would prophesy an explanation of why this bad thing was happening to them. And Isaiah 53 was written at the end of the Babylonian exile. And that's important. Keep that in mind when it was written. So back to the big question then. Who was the suffering servant? What are the traditional non-Christian interpretations?
Yeah, I mean, the view, obviously, because of the timetable, would be that the suffering servant was the Jewish nation as a whole. They're coming out of this exile. That makes logical kind of historical sense. Or the other thing could be that's a righteous minority of the Jewish nation. That would be kind of a subset of the whole Jewish nation that was exiled into Babylon. Because history does talk about this oppression and captivity, and the chances of people staying faithful to Yahweh in a captivity that was as long as the Babylonian thing. There's probably some people that just kind of adapted to Babylonian life and were this isn't really all that bad, because that's human nature.
Especially if you're a kid and that's where you're born. Yeah.
So it stands to reason that as children were born, they were consider themselves Babylonians, maybe. So there could have been just a righteous remnant that was God's going to deliver us from this eventually, and that could have been who the suffering servant was.
Yeah.
So
another interpretation of the righteous minority is that they thought they were being they hadn't done anything wrong. They're we know we haven't sinned, but we must be here because we're being sacrificed for the sins of the rest of Israel, the rest of the Jews. So that's another interpretation. So Bill Zersher, his chapter gives reasons why the righteous minority is the plausible option and way, way, way more plausible than Jesus. He gives a bunch of reasons. So we'll go through those.
The first one is fairly obvious. The author of Isaiah couldn't tell the future. because nobody can.
Well,
So like,
yeah, but why specifically could he not tell the future?
so he couldn't possibly have foreseen Jesus. This is supported by two failed prophecies that he wrote, and they're documented. In Isaiah 52, verse 1, he writes, Jerusalem, the holy city, the uncircumcised and defiled will not enter you again. And in chapter 54, verse 15, he wrote, whoever attacks you will surrender to you. Well, he couldn't have been more wrong about that, because Jerusalem got laid to waste by the Romans in 70 CE. Hadrian banished all the Jews from the city for 200 years, meaning it was actually the uncircumcised or the circumcised people who had to leave, and the uncircumcised were allowed to enter.
So just to reiterate that, Isaiah prophesied that uncircumcised people will never be able to enter the city again. But instead, what ended up happening is that the uncircumcised did come in and the circumcised people had to leave the city, which is the exact opposite of what the prophecy was.
Right. And then there's just like perpetual conquering of Jerusalem, like through history. The Arabs, the Turks, even the European Christians conquered Jerusalem, which is hilarious. The Mongols, the Ottomans, the British, so
just keeps on going.
Yeah. You couldn't have been more wrong.
Yeah. So, okay, he could not tell the future. Yeah. And then his second reason is that the timing of when Isaiah 53 was written suggests that it was written in regards to the Babylonian exile. Because if it was in regards to Jesus, it could have been written anytime. But it was in fact written at 539 BCE.
Yeah, which is a long, long time before Jesus.
Yeah. And the next reason is that most of the suffering servant chapter is in the past tense, whereas you would think it would be in the future tense if it were describing something that was going to happen. Examples of the parts that are in the past: he was pierced, he was crushed, he was oppressed. And the parts of the prophecy that are in the future tense are actually seeming to describe what will happen. He will see his offspring and prolong his days. He will see the light of life. God will give him a portion and he will divide the spoils.
If this was a prophecy about Jesus, it would be all future instead of some of it being past.
Right.
And some of it being future. Yeah, and that's one of those things where Christians can kind of just finagle. Oh, well, that was looking back, and then all this stuff is still future, and then that way they can point to the stuff later in the New Testament.
Yeah, it seems weird. Like there's no point to half of it being past and half of it being future tense if it's all supposed to be a prophecy.
Right.
Okay, so reason number 4 is that nowhere in Isaiah 53 does it contain the word Messiah. And if this was a prophecy about the Messiah, wouldn't it say this is about the Messiah? Right. This is made worse by the fact that the word Messiah or anointed is used in chapter 45 of Isaiah to describe Cyrus the Great. If Isaiah 53 was supposed to be a prophecy about the Messiah, the actual Messiah, why would they use the word Messiah in an earlier passage to describe just a human guy,
right,
but not use it to describe the actual Messiah?
Yeah.
So like, why would Cyrus the Great have been called the Messiah, but Jesus would not have been?
Yeah.
So this would make sense if the suffering servant was not an individual, but was actually a group of people, Israel.
Yeah. All right. So reason number 5 is the chapters that follow Isaiah 53 make a lot more sense if chapter 53 itself refers to the righteous minority than an actual individual. As Christians like to say, context. They always love to say that you're reading that out of context, but then they use their whole Bible out of context. So
exactly.
Yeah. So big plug for this book in general, Seeing Through Christianity.
Oh, it's so
it's really good. The chapters itself, they're not super long. And they're very succinct in the way they just like debunk a particular topic. And he goes through like 20 or 30 different topics, and he's got scholarship, he's got details. So this is a book I would highly recommend. You would as well. It's called Seeing Through Christianity by Bill Zercher. I think that's how you say it. But
what I love about this book is that he doesn't assume too much prior knowledge. So you don't have to be like, sometimes you pick up books by actual scholars and it's like, oh my gosh, I don't even have the background knowledge to make any sense of this. But Bill Zercher doesn't do that. He starts from the beginning and he makes sure that he provides the context for you so that you can understand it. And he's not too wordy.
Yeah.
And for those of us who have ADHD, it's like, you cannot be too wordy because you will just lose me. So perfect. This book is perfect.
It's a really good book. When I first, I think you were the one that told me about it, and I like immediately went and bought it on Amazon, and it was like really good. I mean, I think it's useful for someone that even does have a lot of Bible knowledge, because like I learned a lot of stuff that I had never heard, even though I was like neck deep in the Bible my whole damn life. You know, there's like stuff I was like, oh, well, I never knew that at all.
So Bill Zercher goes line by line through Isaiah 53. In this book, he analyzes every single line, both through the lens of what if it's Jesus and what if it's the righteous minority, which one makes more sense. course, is too detailed for us to cover here. But if that's something you're interested in, you should definitely buy this book.
Go and get it. It's a good one. We don't make any money off it.
You should give us some money for this.
We should get some royalties.
I promise this is not a commercial.
It's not a commercial for the book, but yeah, it's really good. All right, so let's go back to our framework that we talked about with the criteria of what makes a legitimate fulfilled prophecy, and let's see if Isaiah 53 fits the framework. So the first question was, it was verifiably made as a prophecy prior to the events claimed to fulfill it. Does it fit that?
Yes, because it was written before Jesus and they say it's about Jesus, so sure.
We'll give you that one. Okay. Fulfillable by a specific set of circumstances with minimal ambiguity.
Big hell no. No.
That's a hard
people don't even agree what it's about now.
Yeah, it's a hard no. It's very ambiguous. It never mentions the name Jesus. It never says Messiah. It's just like, it's interpretation.
The test is that if you gave it to somebody who had no prior knowledge of Jesus, by the way, I say the word Jesus weird. Have you noticed that? People tell me I say it weird. Like, Jesus.
It's just a name.
I used to say Jesus. And then people are like, why do you say it like that? And I was like, I don't know.
You can say it Jeebus if you want. Or just say grilled cheeses.
Jeebus. Grilled cheeses. So if you gave the prophecy to somebody who had no prior knowledge of that guy, they would not be able to come up with the prophecy. They would not be able to come up with it because there's nothing in it that actually says what it is.
No, yeah. If you just read it, you'd be like, oh, I don't know what this is about at all. It sounds like someone's going through a really shitty time and it doesn't get better for them until the last verse. Like, it's basically all. That's that's what you would get out of it. Like, you're like, this dude's life sucks for how many verses? Is it 12 verses?
Right.
This guy's life sucks, you know.
It's only once you have an end event that you're trying to connect it to that you're like making connections that aren't there.
All right. Next criteria: fulfillable in a specific time window. The narrower, the better.
No, 0 out of 10. No time window was ever given.
Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. You didn't meet that one. All right. Not fulfillable by people aware of it and trying to fulfill it.
This might be the biggest fail of all of them.
I really wish I had like a buzzer sound effect for like each one of these. Maybe we can interject these into the editing and be like,
I should get my taboo buzzer.
Taboo buzzer. All right. So clearly not. Clearly not.
And you know how we know that the New Testament writers knew about the Old Testament so-called prophecies is because they literally wrote in there, this was to fulfill the Old Testament prophecies.
Yeah. All right. Next criteria. Not claimed to be fulfilled only in the same work or collection in which it was claimed as prophecy.
Yeah. Again, that's a fail because both the prophecy and the fulfillment, which is the Gospels, right? That they all happen in the same book. I mean, sort of.
The same text, you know. Because it's convenient to put the Bible all as one text when it's convenient, but when it's not, you say, oh no, that's the Old Testament, you know. So prophecy, it's okay to reference the Old Testament, but if you're referencing something else like stoning your rebellious children, that's the Old Testament. We don't have to reference that. All right. Second to last criteria, not predictable by normal means available to the one prophesying.
Well, I think theoretically a prophecy about Jesus being the Messiah and being crucified, died, and resurrected for our sins and everything, that's not so mundane that it would be easily predictable or like would come true. Like saying that there will be 1 week next year where it will rain a lot. That's pretty predictable and mundane. It's not like that. But as we already established, there actually is no specific prophecy about Jesus. So nothing was actually predicted. It's just so vague.
Yeah.
So this one's NA, not applicable.
It's an NA. And then lastly, was it verifiably fulfilled according to the criteria above?
No, not verifiably.
No, not at all.
So this had like maybe one that it checked, like this checked 1 box of the 7.
Yeah, it checked 1 box.
The first one?
Yeah, that it was written 500 and something years before Jesus.
Okay. So it got 1 out of 7.
1 out of 7.
That's a pretty bad fail.
It's a very bad batting average. Let's go on to Psalm 22, which is the quintessential text for predicting the crucifixion, 1,000 years before he was crucified. All right. This is the most Bible reading I've done in a long time. Man, if this was of the old days, it would have been like a sword drill where I had to like get your Bible out and get the verse as fast as possible. Did you do that in Lutheranism?
I don't know.
You never did sword drills? Here, let's take a quick drip down memory lane real quick. So a sword drill in the fundamentalist universe was 30 kids with their Bibles in youth group or Sunday school. You had to hold the Bible by the binding, so you couldn't have your finger in there. and then the teacher would say a Bible verse, and you would all feverishly search for the verse as quickly as possible, and then you would stand up, and the first person to stand up would read the verse, and then they would get a prize.
Wow.
That's a sword drill.
That's actually kind of fun.
Yeah, it was super fun. I was really good at it, and now I just lost my place. But I used to love some sword drills.
Yeah, we had very different upbringings.
I know. You were probably playing with actual swords and doing fun make-believe, and meanwhile, I'm
Yeah.
all right. Sorry. So we're going to read Psalm 22, verses 12 through 18. All right. Many bulls have compassed me. Strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. They gaped upon me with their mouths as a ravenous and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, and it's melted into the middle of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws, and thou hast brought me into the dust of death.
Okay, this is the part that's important.
For the dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones, and they look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture.
Okay.
Okay.
What translation was that?
What I read from was the Skeptic's Annotated Bible, which is this is the King James version, though. That's why I had all those funky.
All right.
Words. So yeah, King James version.
That's
with
quite funky.
Yeah.
So I got all this information from a video of Dr. Kip Davis, Captain Dadpool, and somebody who I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Natty Nat.
Natty Nat, that's a hilarious name.
Yeah. So they talk about this prophecy, and the part that sounds like a crucifixion is where they pierce my hands and my feet. Obviously, that's the part that people point out when they say this is about Jesus being crucified.
Right.
But the context surrounding it is an animal attack. So it kind of seems out of left field right off the bat. Do you like my two baseball puns?
I do that. Swing and a miss.
Ow. So stepping back through the translations of the word pierced, this is explained by Dr. Kip Davis. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the word in the Septuagint means to dig. So it was translated to the word to dig. So the Greek passage reads, "For many dogs have encompassed me. The counsel of the malignant hath besieged me. They have dug my hands and feet." So admittedly, like they admit this doesn't make much sense.
Right.
This eventually became the word pierce to try to get it to make more sense. And if you go on like Bible Hub, where they have like all the translations listed, there are a lot of them that don't use the word pierce. They use dug or like gouged.
Right.
So it's not unanimous that this is pierced.
Right.
Which you'd think if it was a prophecy that it would be like pretty clear that yes, pierced.
Yeah.
Anyway, so going back to before the Septuagint, in the Hebrew scriptures, the word in Hebrew means like a lion. So the translation is dogs surround me, ... like a lion, my hands and my feet. Okay, this doesn't make much sense either.
No.
So apologists say this must be a scribal error because it's grammatically weird. Like there's no verb. But Dr. Kip Davis says that this apologetic argument should be rejected because it's not at all unusual for Hebrew poetry to have strange sentence constructions like that that lack verbs. So that's normal.
Interesting.
I think this prophecy is like, there's no part of it that actually seems like it's Jesus. And the part about casting lots for my clothing, that easily could have been just written to fulfill that part of the prophecy that they'd already identified as a prophecy. So once you look at the actual translation of the exact words that they're using to say this is a prophecy, it really doesn't hold up.
Yeah. And the other thing that gets used from this chapter is in verse 1, it says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me?" Which is what allegedly Jesus said on the cross, right before he died. So that was a big thing. But again, the chapter actually starts with that. There's no build up. There's no reference to like, what would this be about? Like you could never, again, like you mentioned earlier, you could not hand this chapter to somebody and say, read this thing and tell me what you think it's about, and then go, oh, it's about the crucifixion of Jesus 1,000 years in the future. There's no way you could get that. And it's actually even really hard to get it looking back at it, even though these things. You could take those couple of things that happened on the cross, or the drawing of lots. And one of these translations, I thought it said they didn't break his bones, because it was customary for the Romans to break the prisoner's legs after a certain period of time, so that way they would suffocate. But Jesus, they didn't do that because he was already dead, so they like pierced his side, and they talk about that, which I thought was in Psalm 22. But yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. Also, Psalms doesn't have any other prophecy in it. It's not a prophetic book. In the organization of the Old Testament, Psalms is poetry. And the whole book, 150 chapters of it, is all poetry.
And part of it is in past tense too.
Right.
To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame.
Yeah. And then if you keep going like to the next chapter, like Psalm 23 is like the famous chapter about the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And so then that's probably where they just kind of miss context. They're like, oh, well, 22 is about his death. And then 23 is about how he's going to be our friend. And Psalm 22, big stretch as far as fulfilled prophecy goes. How about some other failed prophecies? I did just kind of some quick searching, and here's a few of them. Well, one of them is a big one about Tyre, the city of Tyre, never being rebuilt. In Ezekiel 26, the whole chapter basically it says that Tyre is never going to be rebuilt. So he updated his prophecy later in Ezekiel 29. This is from an article from Tyndale, which we can put the link to, but it says that he updated the prophecy saying that Nebuchadnezzar was not successful in his attempt to take Tyre, and it's found later in the testimony of Ezekiel himself, some 16 years later after Ezekiel's initial prophecy against Tyre. So he revised it to say, Tyre's not going to be conquered, but Nebuchadnezzar is going to attack it. So he had to because it never got conquered.
I think it's important to point out that the predictions were really specific.
Very, very specific. Yeah.
So I'll just read a little bit of what he said would happen. He will slay your daughters on the mainland with the sword. Your strong pillars will come down to the ground. They will make a spoil of your riches and a prey of your merchandise, break down your walls, destroy your pleasant houses, throw your stones and your timbers and your debris into the water. And I will silence the sound of your songs, and the sound of your harps will be heard no more. And I will make you a bare rock, and you will be a place for the spreading of nets. You will be built no more, for I, the Lord, have spoken. Okay, you will be built no more, for I, the Lord, have spoken.
Yeah, it's very clear.
And that's the Lord saying that, and it didn't come true. And so according to Deuteronomy, this is how you know that a prophet is fake, if the prophecy doesn't come true.
Yeah, especially when that's specific.
Yeah.
Now, what's funny is Christians reframe this whole thing from your favorite place, Got Questions. They have a whole article saying these prophecies came true in amazing detail. They just kind of reframe it, saying that God said many nations would come against Tyre. Okay, well, that's not really that's not really big prophecy because wars and conquering was always happening. So that's not a big deal.
Yeah, it was the norm back then.
Then it lists all the kingdoms that basically attacked Tyre: King Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander the Great, the Muslims conquered Tyre, the Crusaders conquered.
Isn't that just a distraction though? Because it said Nebuchadnezzar was going to be the one to bring down Tyre.
Right.
So that's all irrelevant.
And the thing survived. Nebuchadnezzar didn't win. So then you could say, oh, well, it came true. But that's not what you said. You said Nebuchadnezzar was going to do it.
Yeah, and that it would never be inhabited again.
Right.
And if you go to Wikipedia, the very first sentence says, Tyre is a city in Lebanon, one of the oldest continually inhabited cities in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because the end of this Got Question article saying, it says, when God told Tyre, you will never be rebuilt, he didn't lie. Ancient Tyre was stripped of its glory and strength. Modern Tyre is but a shadow of its former reality. But that's not what it says.
That's not what it said.
It says you will never be rebuilt and no one will ever live there.
So this is moving of the goalposts.
Yes, the moving of the goalposts. It is
just so dishonest. It makes me, you can tell I'm really mad.
Yeah.
This really annoys me and upsets me because people close to me have used Tyre as a reason for why I should believe. Because Tyre was this great prophecy that was fulfilled in an amazing way. Right. And it's all just smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, this is bullshit. All right. So the next failed prophecy one is another city, that's going to be conquered. But Isaiah prophesied an oracle concerning Damascus, saying that Damascus will no longer be a city, but will become a heap of ruins. Well, this is another epic fail because Damascus is still inhabited today with well over 1 million people, and there's never been a time in history when it ceased to be a city. It's also in the list of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. So nice. Damascus still around, another fail. All right, the next one is also from Isaiah. I will hand the Egyptians over to the power of a cruel master. A fierce king will rule them, declares the Lord Almighty. The waters of the river will dry up, and the riverbed will be parched and dry. Okay, well, clearly, if you're talking about Egypt, you're talking about the River Nile, which has never dried up ever, 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 and is still one of Egypt's greatest natural resources. It also says that a fierce king is going to rule over the Egyptians, and I don't know of any time in history that Egyptian were conquered. I'm not well-versed on that.
Would Christians just say that It hasn't dried up yet.
Well, yeah, of course that's what they would say. Yeah, well, it's still
Yeah.
possible that it'll dry up. And of course, then they'll say, when we talk about global warming and the river dries up, they'll say, see, I told you it only took 10,000 years, but it happens. All right. The next one, Isaiah's fraught with failed
Yeah.
prophecies. This one's from Isaiah 52. Awake, awake, O Zion, clothe yourself with strength, put on your garments of splendor. O Jerusalem, the holy city, the uncircumcised and defiled will not enter you again.
So we talked about this one already.
And this is also kind of a funny because there's uncircumcised people that live in Jerusalem now. So because it's not a sacred city anymore. Like the whole idea of Jerusalem being unique to the Jews who were the circumcised people of God, because circumcision was the promise to Abraham to identify Jewish people as the chosen ones of God. So the prophecy says the uncircumcised will never be in this city again. Well, not true. All right, here's another one. All right, Ezekiel 30, 10 and 11. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I will put an end to the hordes of Egypt by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He and his army, the most ruthless of nations, will be brought in to destroy the land. They will draw their swords against Egypt and fill the land with the slain. So Ezekiel is predicting that Nebuchadnezzar is going to conquer Egypt and utterly destroy it and slay and scatter all its people. In 568, Nebuchadnezzar tried to conquer Egypt, and Egypt survived with no apparent damage.
Yikes.
The pharaoh at the time ruled for another generation over a prosperous Egypt and lived to see Nebuchadnezzar die. The Egyptians were not scattered or dispersed. So, wrong again. All right, Ezekiel 29, 10 and 11. Therefore, I am against you and against your streams, and I will make the land of Egypt a ruin and a desolate waste from Migdol to Aswan, as far as the border of Cush. The foot of neither man nor beast will pass through it. No one will live here for 40 years. Again, never in its long history has Egypt been uninhabited for 40 years. So Egypt's like a big target, which probably is also because Egypt was the bad guy, in early Israel, Jewish history, because they were the oppressors. They were the first oppressors, for the Exodus. So they're trying to kick Egypt's ass for thousands of years, and no one could ever do it. All right, last one. This is from the New Testament. Matthew 16:28. I tell you the truth, some of you who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. I tell you the truth, all this will come upon this generation. I tell you this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So that's Jesus talking, where he says that, there's a whole bunch of people that are not going to die before I come back and reign and all that kind of stuff. But clearly, every one of those people died. And we're now 2,000 something years later, still no Jesus.
Yeah, it's funny that I never picked up on that. I was never really scrutinizing stuff before, but why didn't that stand out to me as like, wait a minute.
Yeah, I know.
He said this would happen back then.
Well, I can remember how this one was explained to me.
How?
They would say that Jesus was speaking figuratively.
Of course.
Because if you believe in Jesus, you have eternal life. So you're not tasting death. So even if you physically die, you're going to live eternally, blah, 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 and you'll see the Son of Man coming. No matter when that is. You're still waiting, but you still haven't tasted death because your soul lives forever. So
again, moving the goalposts.
Yeah, that's how they generalize that one. Let's talk about my favorite big word, eschatology, which is the study of end times. Christians have been talking about the end times for like thousands of years now. And it seems like every year there's a rapture prediction now. And now it's not just rapture predictions. Now it's like eclipses are going to cause Armageddon. There's always something. There's actually a list on Wikipedia of the predictions and claims for the second coming.
That's fun.
Have you seen this list?
No, I have not.
This list is hilarious because the earliest predictions for the second coming go all the way back to 500, saying 500 AD, saying that Jesus was returned in the year 500. One prediction was based on the dimensions of Noah's Ark.
Oh, interesting.
They're always using numbers and stuff like that. So from 500 AD on, I don't even know how many are in this list. And this doesn't go to modern times. It ends in 2021, where this guy had previously predicted that Jesus was going to turn in 1988. And then, he's like, oh, I messed up the number. And then it would be within one biblical generation. So it should be 2018 and then 2028 and then 2021 by the latest. So it's really funny. And then there's a list of ones that are still going, future future ones that still have yet to be realized.
I feel like there's more though than
Oh, there's definitely more. This doesn't list all of them because
Yeah.
oh yeah, here's my Harold Camping guy, 2011, Jerry Falwell, my former pastor where I went to his college and all that stuff. He said in 1999 the second coming would probably be within 10 years. Wrong. Ed Dobson, also a pastor guy of mine. I know a lot of these people like actually personally. That's hilarious.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah, I got baptized by Jerry Falwell when I was a kid. Ed Dobson, I was a friend of his family. We used to
Wow.
go to his house. So fun
Wait,
times.
Dobson? Is that the one who
No, not James Dobson.
not James Dobson. Okay.
Yeah, Ed Dobson was a guy in Lynchburg at Liberty that was a professor there, and our family was friends with their families. I used to play soccer with their kid.
That's crazy. And they're just casually on this list of trying to predict
Just
the
on
end
the
times.
list of
No
people
big
who said
deal.
Jesus was going to come back. You know, the two major sources for prophetic information about end times come from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament and then the New Testament book of Revelation. You could talk about Daniel and Revelation for probably like another 3 days.
Yeah.
But Daniel is actually a figure from the Babylonian exile. In fact, he spends his entire life in Babylon, which is kind of documented in the book. But the book of Daniel attributed to him was actually written during the Maccabean revolt, which is like 165 BC.
Right. He was supposed to have come to Babylon in 606 and stayed there for 70 years. So that is quite a while before 165 BCE.
Yeah.
But of course, believers think that it was written way earlier.
Right. You know, like that whole thing, like of like when you read a book in the Bible, you thought it was like written in real time. Every time I read Daniel, I was like, oh, he was like writing this as it happened. You know, he wrote his own story about being in the lion's den. Now looking back at it now, you obviously know that's not how it worked.
Yeah.
And it turns out the guy Daniel was just a guy that somebody else wrote about.
Yeah.
And if this is like falls under the genre of apocalyptic literature, which Bart Ehrman goes into a lot in his book about Revelation, and it's also something I'd never heard of, like apocalyptic literature as a genre.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you take this because I have never read Revelation, and no, I mean, you're the expert on this. I'm just gonna sit here and listen to ask questions.
Yeah, I used to be really fascinated by this stuff, and I really, it's sad because I kind of can't remember all the stuff that I used to believe about it because now it just seems so crazy. But apocalyptic literature in general is like a genre of literature, and Daniel seems to be like the first example of this type of literature where they basically take a story and then it gets conflated to be something in the future later. So,
ooh, okay, I just looked it up on Wikipedia, and the definition is a genre of prophetical writing that developed in post-exilic Jewish culture and was popular among millennialist early Christians. As a genre, it details the author's visions of the end times as revealed by an angel or other heavenly messenger.
Right. But this is kind of this is a little bit long-winded, but it's from this article from PBS about apocalyptic literature, saying this motif of pitching the story back and then carrying the history forward is really what gives apocalypse literature its predictive and prospective quality. It's always telling the story from some past time and then bringing it all the way down. That's why some people call it prophecy. But it's really a new genre of literature, a new way of thinking about the story. And of course, it's what gives it the ability to be thought of as something that's going to happen in the future for us. Some people have referred to this motif of apocalypse literature as prophecy after the fact, because by putting it in the mouth of a person who ostensibly lived a long time ago and letting that person tell the story, it has the quality of predicting the future. Well, if he was right about those events, just think about what he's telling us about our own future, and he gives us the confidence that we can know what God has in store for us, that we know the plan of God for human history. So that's a really good explanation of like why apocalyptic literature resonates that way. Because like when you read it, it sounds like it's futuristic, but it's actually being written about something in the past. So there's a bunch of prophecies in the book of Daniel, you know, that get conflated to the end times. The statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, there's 4 beasts. The 70 weeks is about the tribulation period. They basically do some funky math to explain that the 70 weeks are the 7 years of tribulation that are in Revelation. And they all appear to refer to real life events within human kingdoms, but then they get reinterpreted by the Christians to have significance for the end days when you compare it to Revelation. So Revelation turns out to be kind of just like a retelling of Daniel, so they can make Daniel prophetic. So the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, have you heard anything about that dream that he had?
Yeah, I remember
Yeah,
that dream.
so he
Yeah.
dreamed about the statue and it's made of different materials, and each one of the materials was a different kingdom, which did come to pass. But the author is writing about those kingdoms after the fact. So, of course, he knows that it goes from
Yeah.
Babylon to Cyrus to this to that, And same thing with the four beasts, they're representative kingdoms. So, there's a lot of interesting stuff in Daniel. It's a fascinating book to read, but it's not really prophetic because it's just this style of literature.
Yeah, I do remember like back when I was like 2 years ago, I was really into Daniel, and I of course forget most of it now. But I remember that like up to a certain point, you could track along the prophecies and be like, oh yeah, this is that kingdom, this is that king,
Mm-hmm.
this is that event. And
Yes.
then all of a sudden at a certain point, it's like nothing makes any sense anymore.
Right.
But like that's the part where like the whoever wrote Daniel was like, okay, I've written about everything I know that happened in the past as if it's going to happen in the future. And
Right.
now I'm going to actually try to prophesy some
Yeah.
actual things that might happen. But of course, it didn't come true.
Yeah, I think some scholars said that he basically wrote up to his current time. And so
Yeah.
that's why the details then after that become nebulous and they don't make any sense because he's like, I'm just going to make
Yeah.
up some shit. And none of that stuff actually happened. So Revelation is like kind of the New Testament version of Daniel. And it's also the same thing. It's apocalyptic literature. Bart Ehrman, who's like my favorite scholar these days, wrote a whole book about Revelation where he kind of digs into the stories in there. And he kind of puts forth the idea that the book of Revelation, which a lot of Christians today would view as like a book of hope because it ends with, Christ winning and all that kind of stuff. He kind of makes the case that the whole book is really disturbing, and that there's no concept of love or salvation in the book. It's just a lot of freaking killing and a lot of blood. And so, a couple things about the book itself. It was written by John. Again, we're not sure which John it was written by, the Apostle John, but whoever this John was, he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos and he wrote the book around 95 AD. The book itself wasn't even accepted in the biblical canon for a very, very long time, all the way up to like even Martin Luther said it wasn't prophetic or apostolic in 1522.
So this is interesting because we never, as a Lutheran, we never really dwelled on Revelation. And my mom has even said she's never read it because she finds it too scary.
Yeah.
If Martin Luther had said it was important, then you better bet we would all be reading it.
Right. But there's a long list of like how people fought over this book and how a lot of people thought it shouldn't have been in the Bible, and which I think also like just chinks holes in the credibility of the Bible because it's just a bunch of dudes deciding what goes in there. So it's like, oh, we don't like that book. It shouldn't go in. So
yeah.
And there's fewer manuscripts of Revelation than any other part of the New Testament. There's only 310 manuscripts of Revelation. Obviously, they're not complete. Obviously, they're not originals. So that's not a lot of details. So Revelation, according to many scholars, including Ehrman, and he makes a big case for this, is that it's really all about Rome, and it's the same thing that Daniel did in Daniel. The author of Revelation does with Rome. He basically takes all the things that are happening about Rome, and Christians now interpret them to be future, but they're clearly all about Rome. There's a lot of things, even down to the concept of 666, that is straight from a Roman historical thing. I forget which emperor it was. Trajan.
I think it was Nero.
Yeah, I think it was Nero.
But that was like every letter is a number or something.
Yeah.
Or how did that work? Something.
Yeah,
it was like some kind
I
of
forget
code.
what it is. He explains it in the thing. I actually always liked this book. I just thought it was fascinating reading. And I used to be obsessed with this band called Savior Machine. And they were like from Germany, and they were like an Christian apocalyptic band. And they wrote like this epic rock opera to the book of Revelation. They go through the whole book of Revelation from beginning to end. And it's like crazy. I'm not going to go into all the things, but like the whole book paints a picture of this idea from Christian standpoint that there's going to be a big battle, and then in the end, Jesus comes out on top. It's kind of like why Christians like to say, oh, we read the back of the book and we win. That's basically what from Revelation. So there's a lot of different interpretations related to eschatology or end time events And I think the number of these interpretations just demonstrates why it can't actually be prophetic. So you've got this historicism view, which sees Revelation as just like this broad view of history. You've got the preterist view, which most of Revelation refers to events of the apostolic era and the fall of Jerusalem and the Roman Empire.
Oh, so like preterism is like it already took place. It's already all been fulfilled.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
There's nothing left to do. Yeah.
And then you've got futurism, which believes that Revelation describes future events, which modern believers, in this vein would call it, they're called millennialists because they believe that the 1,000-year reign of Jesus is all future, all that kind of stuff. Then you have the idealism and allegoricalism, which holds that Revelation does not refer to anything actual, but it's just an allegory of the spiritual path and the struggle between good and evil. Okay, you can go that route too. And then there's significant differences in the interpretations of the 1,000 years that's mentioned in Revelation chapter 20. This was a big sticking point when I was a Christian growing up, because I was a pre-millennial, pre-tribulational person. So that meant that you believed that Christians would be raptured before the tribulation. And so there's like pre-tribulational, there's mid-tribulational, there's post-tribulational, and same thing with the millennial. There was pre-millennial, which believed that in a literal interpretation of the millennium, and that generally prefers literal interpretations of the book. You had amillennialists, which reject the literal interpretation of the book, and everything is allegorical. And then you have post-millennial, which kind of just blends them both together.
This is way too complicated to be real.
Yeah, well, that's just it. And that's actually kind of the point. That is why I put all that in there, because when you get talking to people in the church about this kind of stuff, it's like fierce battles, especially the tribulational stuff. Our churches preached pre-tribulational, that Christians wouldn't go through the tribulation, which is the time, when the mark of the beast would happen and all the Christians were going to be killed and all that kind of stuff. And if you ran into someone who believed that, oh, you were mid-tribulational, or that Christians went through the tribulation, it was such a point of contention. It all just demonstrated that no one actually knew what was true.
Yeah. As a Lutheran, we never cared about any of this.
Right.
This was never mentioned at all.
That's hilarious. Like, I mean, I can't imagine a church experience where I wasn't terrified by the concept of the rapture and the tribulation and all this kind of stuff. So you missed out on the whole old movie series that was like Thief in the Night and Distant Thunder and all that stuff. Have you ever heard of those?
I've heard of them, but only after I left and I met all you guys.
On my 10th birthday party, I was 10 years old. And I had 12 10-year-olds in my house, and we watched the movie Thief in the Night.
That's traumatizing.
It's a terrifying movie. I was 10 years old, and I
know we say this all the time, but how great is it that our kids don't have to go through that?
I know. They have no concept of this. And that, the Left Behind series came out in the 2000s, and that was all the rage, those books, and they came out with movies of it. It's a fascinating stuff. But again, this is one of those things that Christians use as, well, this is how we know it's true, because all this stuff is going to happen. But there's no proof that it's going to happen. And there's people believe that it all already happened. And some people believe that it's all just allegory. With all those different interpretations, how could any of it be real? All right. So that's that. Daniel and Revelation. There's a lot more that you could talk about that, but they kind of just serve to demonstrate that the idea of prophecy, when you're talking about future events, it doesn't meet the criteria for fulfilled prophecy, and it's not ever going to.
So there is foretelling and then there's forthtelling. What's the difference, Phil?
So this is kind of how I viewed spiritual gifts when you talked about the gift of prophecy. When Paul talks about spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians, we said this already, but he's talking about everyone's obsession with speaking in tongues at the time. But he tells everyone in that letter, seek the better gifts, and he includes prophecy in that list. The verse actually says, pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy.
So you were like a legit Christian if you could prophesy.
Yeah, if you could prophesy, but of course, prophecy in the fundamentalist evangelical world was not predicting the future. Those were false prophets. Anybody who said that they could predict the future in Christianity when I was a kid was a false prophet.
Okay.
So all the rapture predictors, all those people, we made fun of every one of them.
So that's foretelling what you're talking about. So telling the future is foretelling.
Right.
And that
foretellings.
was bad.
Yeah. So then they said that now the gift of prophecy during the church age was forthtelling, meaning you were proclaiming the message of Christ in some way, shape, or form. That was what prophecy was. So predicting the future was out the window. But now, if you're a pastor, if you're an evangelist, if you're a teacher, well, then you have the gift of prophecy. And I can verify this because I took many spiritual gift inventories, which, like I was telling you earlier, were like fake psychometric tests to basically determine what your spiritual gift was. And some of them were replicated off like the Myers-Briggs and stuff like that. So it felt like it was a real test. And then you come out with a spiritual gift, a main one, a minor one, and blah, blah, blah. It's like a spectrum. And I always came out with prophecy.
Well, good for you.
Mm-hmm.
So if evangelical Christians thought that foretelling was bad, then would they not have believed all these prophecies about like when COVID was going to end or like when the rapture is happening? Because those are telling the future. So would they have just automatically not believed them? Would your parents have not believed them?
Yeah, by and large, when I was a kid, like Harold Camping and all those guys that were predicting the rapture, we didn't buy into that.
Oh, okay.
Because we were always like, oh, the Bible says no man knows the day or the hour. This guy's an idiot, which is what they might have said publicly. That's what my parents would have said. And probably secretly, they would have hoped that he was right, but they would have never admitted it because then they knew they would look like an idiot if it didn't happen because it had already happened. The rapture predictions had already been wrong many times. Yeah. As far as the COVID ending thing, I don't know that like my parents didn't buy into the idea of like somebody prophesying, that it would end, but they just bought into the thing that COVID wasn't real.
Oh, nice.
So that's a whole different can of worms,
That's really nice.
And the vaccine was, the mark of the beast and yada, yada. Okay. Let me talk about my spiritual gift experience. So I took a lot of these tests, like as a kid, as a teenager, as a college student. I always landed with the gift of prophecy for whatever reason. Obviously, because I like to run my fucking mouth.
Yeah, it fits.
The questions were all about, do you like to talk? Do you like to stand up in front of people? Well,
that's how they determined it.
I'm sure that wasn't the exact questions, but like,
okay,
it would be like, things along that nature that basically was like asking you about questions about your personality. And then it was conflating those things with a spiritual gift. So, okay, if you're a public speaker and you're outgoing, well, you have the gift of prophecy. But if you're like a caring person and you like to support people, well, then you might have the gift of helps or whatever. If you're like always positive and you might have the gift of encouragement, blah, 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 So I was always landing in the prophecy thing. And, people would tell me, oh yeah, you're going to go to school to become a pastor. And, my dad was a pastor. So I probably, he had the gift. So should you. And blah, blah, blah. That whole thing like shaped my life. Like I went to Bible Institute, like for college my first year, because I thought that's what I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be a pastor or a missionary or whatever,
So your spiritual gift says that you were supposed to be able to foretell or be like a mouthpiece for God, basically, but not tell the future. But why would the gift change? So if like in biblical times it was telling the future, why would that be different now?
Well, so they believed the explanation for that was, well, because Jesus came, he fulfilled all the prophecies. So now we don't need anyone to tell the future.
Oh, so the river that's going to dry up, the time has expired.
Yeah, that's up,
Okay,
that's
so time is up for all prophecies.
Time's up for all prophecy. Yeah.
I'm glad we clarified that.
Yeah. So except for those that believed in, the rapture predictions and, all that kind of stuff. So like there's this constant moving of the goalposts, which is like, why would you have to do that if it was real? It doesn't work. If you have to modify, if you have to move the goalposts, if you have to
update making excuses for it.
Yeah, if you have to update your rapture prediction, well, then that just shows that you don't know what the hell you're talking about, like.
Well, is that supported anywhere in the Bible?
There's nowhere in the Bible that I'm trying to think, like, if there was a verse, there's probably some verse that can be, misconstrued and interpreted to say that these gifts were for that time only. The one I always heard of was that tongues was always the gift that was only supposed to be for the early church because we hated charismatics, so those charismatic people were wacky and they were also into prophecy. So that would have been the same thing, but there's nothing in the Bible that says, well, prophecy was only for the apostolic time or the time before Jesus. It doesn't make sense. So how do Christians get to adapt their theology to now mean whatever they want it to mean? This is what happens all the time when you're in Christianity and you don't notice it when you're in it. You don't notice that these goalposts are moving all the time.
Like they use Jesus like, oh, he came and so we don't need to do that anymore. He changed this rule.
Yeah.
It's like a very convenient excuse that you can use Jesus to be like, change anything. You don't like something. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's, different flavors of this. Like what we were just talking about is like more about evangelical Christianity, that prophecy isn't a gift for today. Charismatic Christianity would say that prophecy is still, God telling the prophet things that will encourage their flock to think that their life is going to get better because of their faith. So this is kind of like your prosperity gospel people.
Mm-hmm.
And then even in the progressive realm of Christianity, the idea of a prophet is somebody that like speaks truth to power. They talk out about injustice. They focus on building the kingdom of God on earth. And then they'll say that, this is really what the Old Testament prophets did. The Old Testament prophets went to these kings and they said, hey, you're doing shit to God's people and you're going to pay for it, which they hardly ever did. So the whole idea of prophecy having these different adaptations depending on what flavor of Christianity you have, again, just
Yeah.
kind of adds to the lack of credibility.
Yeah, like I'm trying to think of like a natural phenomenon that actually exists that we can collect data for that has this many different interpretations of it. There wouldn't be because it's real and you can test it and make
Right.
observations that are reproducible, but you can't do that with prophecy. And all the prophecies don't come true. There's no way you can validate them because there's like none that ever come true. Is
Right.
there a single one that's
I,
ever come true that fits all seven of those
no, it's like
no, there's not.
they're all like interpreted to be fulfilled, but they're never
Right.
actually verifiably fulfilled.
No. And if there was, that would be maybe a clear sign that, like, hey, this religion is worth investigating, then maybe there's
Right.
something behind it. But time after time after time, we've seen these prophecies fail. They fail, but they don't even qualify as a valid prophecy that can be tested because of like the 6 bullet points that Lars came up with.
Yeah.
It doesn't even fulfill those.
Right. And I think, if some Christian was to look at those criteria or whatever, they would just dismiss them all, saying they would just say, well, that's the human way that you would prove prophecy is real. Well, I believe it's true, and so therefore it's true. Like
Yeah.
which is how they explain away anything that when you ask for data and evidence, you just say, well, I just have faith and I
But
just
if there
feel
were
it.
a prophecy in the Quran that they wouldn't accept it because like it's not specific enough.
Right. And you'll see them do that because they'll say, "Oh, in the Mormon Bible, all that stuff that's bullshit because it's not specific enough, or the Quran or any other holy book."
Or it wasn't fulfilled because it was slightly different than what it said would happen.
Right, right. They'll nitpick those to death.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but they won't be critical about their own book.
To wrap this up, I mean, it's a big topic. I mean, I think the idea of prophecy today, like I don't know how many people are really maybe in the deconversion space. I feel like prophecy is not one of those things that's like a big impactful thing, but there are people that are, they are swayed by the idea of like
Yeah.
future things coming true, and like what if there is this future thing, and what if there's an Armageddon, and what if there's a rapture, and what if there's a hell, and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully this episode and the data and the stories and if anything, just the long list of freaking failed prophecies from the
Yeah.
from the Bible will kind of help reinforce the idea that, again, if there's not evidentiary support for something, there is no reason for you to accept it as true.
Yeah. And I think it's important to be on the lookout for when Christians will say to you, this is a prophecy that's been fulfilled, and this is why you should believe.
Mhm.
That's been said to me before. Go back to that list of 7, and maybe we'll publish it somewhere on the Facebook group.
Yeah.
Go back to that list and point out to them exactly why their prophecy doesn't count as a prophecy and
Yeah.
why it's not fulfilled, and stick to that. Don't let them talk you out of it.
Yeah.
And bring it back to like if this was in another religious text,
Yeah.
you would be more critical. You would stick to those 7 steps. The
Yeah.
7 bullet points. Also, if you do want to know more about some of the prophecies that we talked about, like Tyre, in the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament by Joshua Bowen, there's a chapter just on Tyre. There's also a chapter on Daniel. And of course, Seeing Through Christianity is an invaluable resource.
Yeah, and we'll be I think this episode is going to have a lot of stuff in the show notes, a lot of links to stuff to look at. So if you want to dig into the stuff a little bit further, you can just have at it. And if you got questions and stuff, or you want to have like further discussion about it, definitely join us on the Facebook group. Post your questions in there. And we're by no means experts on this stuff. We kind of just dig in this stuff because we find it's interesting, and hopefully what we've uncovered for you today will be helpful for you in your own journey. Again, I want to remind you guys again about Tim and Harmonic Atheist. We'll post in the show notes again his links for his fundraiser and for his channels. Please give him some support if you are financially able, or if you're not financially able, just go follow his content and check it out because he appreciates and needs that support any way that he can. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Flawed Theology Podcast. I'm Phil.
And I'm Susie. Tune in next time where we will continue to tackle the question, if your theology were wrong, wouldn't you want to know?
Follow us on Facebook and join our group, Dangerous Questions. You can listen to us on flawedtheologypodcast.com and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Rate and review us on YouTube Music now, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts from. We appreciate the feedback and the votes of confidence. Again, if you have topics or questions, feel free to send those to us, and we will do our best to address them maybe in a future episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you next time.